In 330 BC, Alexander the Great entered Persepolis, the ceremonial center of the Persian Empire. Behind its palace walls was wealth collected across the empire for generations. Together with royal treasuries already captured elsewhere, Alexander may have seized 180,000 to 200,000 Attic talents, equivalent in value to close to 5,000 tons of silver. One rough modern comparison puts the scale at around $350 billion. It looked like enough money to solve every problem a conqueror could have. But money locked inside a treasury does very little. The moment Alexander began moving it, turning it into coins and spending it, the treasure started changing the world outside the palace. How could the greatest fortune of the ancient world put more money into circulation and still leave ordinary people able to buy less? To understand that, we need to follow what Alexander did with the treasure. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BC, money was already a problem. The campaign began with limited cash, debts to pay, and an army that needed regular wages. Soldiers needed food, horses needed fodder. Ships, siege equipment, transport and troops left behind to hold conquered cities all required money. Every victory solved one military problem and created a larger financial one. That changed dramatically in 331 BC, when Alexander defeated the Persian king Darius at Gaugamela. The victory opened the road to Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and later Ecbatana. Each city gave Alexander access to another royal treasury. By this point, the captured wealth was being counted in hundreds of thousands of talents. Each talent represented about 26 kilograms of silver by weight. Measured against a soldier's daily pay, the total Persian haul represented well over 1 billion days of wages. But before Alexander could spend that kind of fortune, he first had to move it. According to the ancient historian Diodorus, Alexander called for large numbers of pack and draft mules, together with 3,000 camels, to carry the treasure away from Persepolis. The image gives some sense of the scale. Thousands of animals carrying away the wealth of an empire. Soon afterwards, the palace complex at Persepolis burned. But by then, the treasure was already on the move. The center of Persian power could be destroyed. Its wealth had begun a very different journey. Far away in Babylon, scribes were recording how much barley, dates, sesame, wool, and other goods could be bought for a fixed amount of silver. Their clay tablets would preserve what happened next. The Persian treasure was not simply a huge pile of ready-to-spend coins. It included silver and gold in different forms, along with currencies collected from across the empire. To pay soldiers and suppliers, much of this wealth had to be weighed, divided, moved, and turned into new coins. Alexander's silver coins used the familiar Attic weight standard. They showed Heracles on one side and Zeus on the other. For soldiers and merchants, the important part was that the money followed a system they already understood. Persian treasure was becoming familiar, spendable silver. Studies of surviving coins suggest that silver from the Persian treasuries supplied a large part of Alexander's coinage. His successors would later use even more of that Persian silver. The treasure did not end the cost of war. It gave Alexander the money to keep fighting. After Darius was defeated, Alexander could have treated the conquest of Persia as complete. Instead, he continued through Central Asia and eventually into India. Every new conquest meant longer supply lines, more forts, more troops, and more rewards to pay. Every new success created another bill. But Alexander was not only spending the treasure on campaigns, he was also using it to solve problems inside his own army. In 324 BC, at Susa, he offered to pay the personal debts of his soldiers. At first, the men hesitated. Alexander wanted a record of how much each soldier owed. Some feared the list would reveal who had been living beyond his pay, and that the king might hold it against them. So Alexander changed the system. No names had to be recorded. A soldier only had to show proof of a debt and it would be paid. Arrian places the total as high as 20,000 talents. Alexander was using Persian treasure to wipe out the private debts of the men who had helped him conquer Persia. A few months later, many of those same Macedonians rebelled against Alexander at Opis. As more Persians entered his army, the Macedonians feared that they were being replaced. Alexander eventually settled the confrontation and sent thousands of veterans home with pay and gifts. But paying their debts had not removed their fear. Money could keep an army paid. It could not guarantee its trust. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon. His empire still depended heavily on his personal authority, his army, and his money. Then, in June, he died at the age of 32. There was no adult heir ready to take control of the empire, the army, and the treasure. His senior commanders immediately began competing for power. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and others began fighting for control of different parts of the empire. What followed was not a simple transfer of power. It was years of war between men who had once fought together under Alexander. And in those wars, control of the treasure meant control of soldiers. Whoever had money could recruit an army. Whoever had an army could seize territory. And holding that territory required still more money. Alexander had used the Persian treasure to finance one expanding war machine. His former commanders now used it to finance several competing ones. They also kept minting coins with Alexander's name and familiar designs. The conqueror was dead, but a dead conqueror was still useful on payday. Now return to the Babylonian tablets. How can we possibly know what happened to prices in a city more than 2,000 years ago? Because Babylon's astronomers were recording much more than the sky. Alongside eclipses, planetary movements, and the level of the Euphrates, they recorded market prices every month. For 6 basic goods, they noted how much 1 shekel of silver could buy. Those tablets became an accidental record of Babylon's economy. And after Alexander's death, they recorded an extraordinary price shock. The clearest example was barley. A quantity of barley that had cost 3.33 shekels of silver rose to 6 shortly after Alexander died. By January and February of 322 BC, surviving records placed the price between 13 and 15 shekels. At the peak, that was more than 4 times the earlier price. That does not mean every price across Alexander's empire rose 4-fold. The records are incomplete, and the clearest evidence comes from Babylon. But studies of those records suggest that food there was, for a time, roughly twice as expensive as usual. Normal conditions did not return for more than 20 years. So what happened? Alexander did not turn all 5,000 tons of treasure into coins and suddenly flood Babylon with them. We cannot know exactly how much Persian silver reached Babylon or how quickly. But several things were happening at the same time. More Persian silver was entering circulation through military pay, government spending, and new coins. At the same time, competing armies needed huge amounts of food, animals, workers, and transport. And war could damage farms, interrupt trade, and make supplies harder to move. Picture a market in Babylon as Alexander's empire begins to break apart. A Macedonian soldier receives his pay in silver and goes looking for barley. Around him are other soldiers, government buyers, and local families trying to buy the same food. More people now have silver to spend, but there is not suddenly more barley to buy. And if war has disrupted farming or transport, there may actually be less. Sellers can ask for more silver. For families whose income does not rise as quickly as prices, the same food becomes harder to afford. There can be more money on the table and less food beside it. That is why the simple claim that Alexander caused inflation is tempting, but incomplete. Alexander captured the Persian treasure and began paying it out to soldiers, officials, and suppliers. But the sharpest price shock came after his death, when several of his former commanders needed that same silver to fight one another. The inflation was not caused by silver alone. It was caused by silver released into a political collapse. Alexander captured a fortune large enough to seem limitless, but treasure is not prosperity. He turned Persia's stored wealth into the fuel of conquest. After his death, other men used it to fight over the world he had taken. Babylon was left with more silver, higher prices, and no Alexander. For more of the wildest true stories about money, subscribe to Money Stories.